St. Catherine's Academy once stood as a grand old school nestled in the dense woods just outside town. Over a century ago, when tuberculosis ravaged the country, the school was repurposed as a makeshift hospital to treat the infected. After the epidemic faded, the nuns stayed behind, and St. Catherine's became a mental asylum. It was during this time that Sister Agnes, one of the nuns who cared for the mentally ill, lost her grip on reality. Overwhelmed by the madness around her, she descended into a depression so deep that she couldn't take it anymore. One night, she quietly injected 29 patients with lethal doses of rat poison, watching as they screamed and foamed at the mouth. Then, in the dead of night, she hung herself in the very asylum halls she used to walk. Jake, Emily, and Chris had heard the rumors about St. Catherine's Academy for years. The local legend was famous: an abandoned building that had once been a hospital, then a mental asylum, and now a haunted relic. The teens, itching for a thrill, decided to spend the night exploring the decrepit school, hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural. It was a dark, moonless night when they approached the rusted gates. The tall, Gothic building loomed before them, its windows shattered and its walls cracked with age. A cold wind blew through the trees, carrying with it a distant echo, like a faint scream in the night. "Are we really doing this?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Come on, you can't back out now," Jake grinned, pushing open the gate with a loud screech. The trio crept inside, the air thick with dust and decay. Old hospital beds lay scattered across the hallways, their wheels squeaking in the stillness. Faded posters about tuberculosis treatment hung on the walls, reminders of the building's grim past. The deeper they ventured, the more the atmosphere shifted. An unnatural cold seeped into their bones, and a heavy silence fell over them. They passed a row of old patient rooms when suddenly a hospital bed in the corner of the room moved, scraping across the floor on its own. The sound was deafening in the otherwise quiet hall, and they all froze. "What the hell was that?" Chris whispered, his face pale. They stared at the bed, which had stopped just as suddenly as it had moved. "Let's just keep going," Jake muttered, his bravado fading. They hurried deeper into the asylum, but the sense of dread only grew. As they approached the former ward for the mentally ill, they heard it. Faint but unmistakable. A distant scream echoed down the hall, sharp and piercing, like someone crying out in agony. Emily clutched Jake's arm. "I don't like this," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "It's like the walls are screaming." Just as they rounded a corner, they saw a figure at the end of the hallway. It was a man dressed in tattered asylum clothes, banging his head violently against the wall. His movements were erratic, his head hitting the concrete over and over, blood trickling down his face. But when Jake called out, the man disappeared, fading into nothing. They were panicking now. Their footsteps quickened as they navigated the maze-like hallways, but the asylum wasn't done with them yet. The air grew thick, the walls seemed to close in, and the eerie sound of footsteps followed them, though no one was there. It wasn't until they reached the old chapel, where the nuns had once prayed, that the true horror revealed itself. The door slammed behind them as soon as they entered, and in the corner of the room, they saw her, Sister Agnes, swaying slowly from the ceiling, her lifeless body hanging from an old rope. Her head lolled to the side, her eyes wide open and staring blankly at them, but her mouth began to move. A voice, not hers, but something deeper, darker, echoed in the room. The trio screamed, darting out of the chapel and running toward the nearest place to hide, the old bathroom. They bolted inside, slamming the door shut behind them. The air in the small room was thick with mold and decay, but it felt safer than the chapel. Panting, Jake leaned against the sink. "We have to get out of here, now." But as they tried to catch their breath, Emily's eyes widened in horror. She pointed, speechless, at the space behind them. Suspended in the air, her legs swaying inches above the ground, was Sister Agnes. Her rope no longer around her neck, she was floating in the air behind them. Her lifeless eyes locked onto theirs. They screamed, rushing out of the bathroom as the nun's body disappeared in a blur of dark shadows. They ran toward the entrance, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls, the sound of distant screams following them. But they didn't look back. Not once. Months later, in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a man stepped out of his front door with a carton of empty milk boxes in his hand. As he tossed one of the boxes into the recycling bin, something caught his eye. He paused, turning the carton around to see the familiar missing children section printed on the back. There, in black and white photos, were the faces of 3 teenagers, Jake, Emily, and Chris. Their faces stared back at him from the milk carton, their fate sealed in the forgotten halls of St. Catherine's. They were never seen again, their story fading into local legend, just like the spirits who roamed the cursed asylum. Evelyn's inspection of the abandoned Blackwood foundry turns terrifying as ghostly, burnt workers surround her. Their whispers grow louder, and the shadows close in, their cold hands reaching for her as the darkness deepens. Evelyn worked for the city's redevelopment agency, a quiet job that rarely sent her to dangerous places, until the old Blackwood foundry. Abandoned for decades after a tragic collapse killed over 100 workers, the foundry sat like a scar on the edge of town. Stories swirled about what had happened there, but Evelyn dismissed them as nothing more than urban legends. When her boss asked her to inspect the site for redevelopment, Evelyn was reluctant but went anyway. The sun was already setting when she arrived, and a thick fog rolled in from the nearby river, blanketing the area in a cold, clammy mist. The building loomed ahead, crumbling and broken, but still standing. The foundry's towering smokestacks pierced the evening sky like skeletal fingers, and Evelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Her footsteps echoed eerily as she crossed the cracked courtyard, every sound swallowed by the mist. The front door groaned as it opened, the old hinges protesting her intrusion. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rust and something faintly foul, like old rot. Her flashlight cut through the darkness in weak beams, casting long shadows across the floor where heaps of twisted metal and broken machinery lay abandoned. As she ventured deeper into the foundry, Evelyn heard something, a faint scraping, like metal being dragged across concrete. She stopped, her heart quickening. The noise came again, closer now. She swallowed hard, telling herself it was just the building settling or a piece of debris shifting. Still, her hand trembled as she held the flashlight, its beam flickering slightly. She pushed on, her goal a storage room at the back of the building. The city's record said it was sealed off, but she had to check. When she reached the room, the door was ajar, though rusted and heavy. Something felt wrong, terribly wrong. The scraping sound returned, louder now, accompanied by a faint whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. Her breath caught in her throat as the flashlight beam flickered and then died, plunging her into darkness. She cursed, fumbling with it, when suddenly the door behind her slammed shut. Her heart pounded in her ears as she banged on the door, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. In the suffocating silence that followed, a new sound emerged, breathing. Slow, labored breaths, rasping and wet. It came from behind her. Evelyn spun around, her flashlight sputtering to life just long enough to reveal a figure standing in the far corner of the room. It was a man, or something that had once been a man, his face twisted in agony, his eyes wide and unblinking. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, and his skin was scorched, blackened by fire. Then, as she watched in horror, he moved. His body jerked unnaturally, limbs contorting as though pulled by unseen strings. He staggered toward her, his burnt face locked in that frozen scream. The sound of chains rattled behind him, dragging across the floor, and in the dim light, Evelyn saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures, burnt and broken, all staring at her with hollow eyes. They were the workers, the ones who had died when the foundry collapsed. The air around her grew thick, heavy with their suffering, and the whispers became louder, filling her ears with desperate pleas for release. But she couldn't move. The terror had frozen her in place. The figures surrounded her now, their cold, dead hands reaching out. The man at the front, the foreman, she realized, grinned, his charred lips cracking as he whispered, "Join us." The last thing Evelyn felt was their hands pulling her down, dragging her into the darkness. The next morning, the redevelopment team arrived at the site, ready to begin demolition. But no one ever found Evelyn, or any trace of her for that matter. The foundry remained untouched, and the workers who ventured close swore they could still hear her screams echoing from deep inside. Thanks for diving into the shadows with us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Stay curious, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the truth is scarier than fiction. Until next time, sleep tight if you can.